Welcome to Tending to Talks. This is our 9th episode. If you're a newbie here, Tending to Talks is a non-physical space where we broaden our myopic vision, visit some of the challenges of our modern societies, and discuss problematic, sometimes conflicting areas of knowledge. A buffet-type sort of podcast. Take what you like most and take a lot. My guest today is Mahzarin Banaji, a prominent psychologist known for her groundbreaking work in the field of social psychology, particularly in the areas of implicit bias, stereotyping, and prejudice. She is the Richard Clarke Cabot Professor of Social Ethics at Harvard University, where she founded the university's program in implicit social cognition. Her work has earned her numerous awards and honors, including election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. Mahzarin's contributions have not only advanced our understanding of human cognition, but have also inspired efforts to address societal inequalities and promote social justice. Mahzarin is currently developing an online course titled Outsmarting Implicit Bias, which you can find at www.outsmartingimplicitbias.org. Several modules are already available, and Harvard will launch the course online starting in July of the current year. That is 2024 for those unsure. If you're interested in previewing the course content and taking implicit bias tests, you can find the links below this episode. Feel free to explore them before having a listen to our conversation, or you can dive into them afterward, whichever feels more natural. Thank you so much for being here, Mahzarin.
Thank you, Anna, for having me.
So what we're going to talk about today is people being biased without the awareness of being biased. So basically your usual family dinner, right? You write that we must confront the uncomfortable truth that we are not colorblind or unbiased, but rather products of a deeply biased society. What is implicit memory and subsequently implicit bias? Who's Stephanie Weisdorf and why isn't she famous?
Well, that's a very good way to ask the question and puzzle your audience about who is Stephanie Weisdorf. Well, before I even tell you about the research, it perhaps would be interesting to your audience to know that if you want to solve the problem of implicit bias or understand it, you don't go about trying to solve the problem of implicit bias or saying, I'm going to understand it. And that's because we didn't even know that there was a thing such as an implicit bias. And why should we have known it, given that it's hidden from us? You know, just like in other parts of science, it was in the past hidden from us that the Earth is round. We didn't know that. Okay? Or that there are galaxies out there besides our own. We didn't know that. We were blind to these facts, not because we're dumb or not paying attention, but because even these physical realities were outside of the capacity for ordinary perception, right? But for reasons that have to do with human nature, our ability for conscious awareness, this amazing gift given to us by evolution, our remarkable capacity for language, that you and I can share these things called ideas and thoughts, our tendency, which I believe is deeply natural to us, to collaborate, to do great things together, not just on our own. I mean, because of all of these, we imagined, what if we're not alone in the universe? If the Earth is flat, why don't we fall off the edge? Are there universes out there? These ways of thinking led scientists to do things like invent little machines, technologies that, the simple one being, of course, like a telescope, allowing us to break the bonds of natural vision. And when the data came back saying, hey, we're not at the center of the universe as we had thought, or as Darwin taught us that, we're not God's chosen species. Now is the interesting question. What are we going to do with those data? And that's where, the issues become fraught. The Vatican surely wasn't happy, hearing what Galileo said. And if we just think about that history of something as simple as the invention of the telescope, of being able to look far enough, coming back with data about hidden things that now suddenly are teaching us something new, I think if we understand that, the parallel to what we will talk about today on implicit bias is very much the same. It's exactly the same. We didn't know. So when we go back to the question that you pose, what is implicit memory? And I'm glad that you say that, because a lot of people don't focus on that origin. This question did not come to me because I thought, I wonder if there's something called implicit bias and I should go looking for it. That's not how it happens in science. It is messy. It is serendipity that is needed, and perhaps some awareness when you come upon something to say, aha, that's important, even though I wasn't looking for it. And that's my story. I wasn't looking to study implicit bias. I had never thought about issues of bias. I hadn't even thought much about the categories that we speak about today so freely, about what does it mean to be female or male? What does it mean to be binary? What does it mean to be of a certain ethnic group or a certain nationality, and so on? These are questions that are now, contested and debated all the time in our society. But in the 1980s, life was a lot more dull, and we were not thinking about these things. I came upon it through the work of a brilliant psychologist by the name of Larry Jacoby. Larry was interested in this particular discovery that maybe there were ways in which human beings were able to know things. Things were in our head. Things were enough in our head, and we had enough memory for it that we were using that information, but we were not aware that we had that information. In other words, if I asked a direct question, I would not get the answer. But an indirect method might lead us to see that it was there. That was the idea. And I'm not saying this terribly well, so I'll just give you an example of certain patients who made it very easy for us to see it. So these are, let's say, patients with a certain kind of disorder. They have deep amnesia. They cannot remember events either prior to a certain date or post a certain date because of trauma. And the early data came back from these people showing that although they could not remember things like, what did you eat for breakfast? They could not tell you, because if some small amount of time had passed, that event would be gone from their conscious recollection. But the data came back that they were aware of it at some other level, enough that it was being used in decision making. And I can go on in a lot of depth on this, but I won't, other than to say that those were the first signals that there might be a form of memory that we have that is not reachable by our conscious awareness. And people like Larry Jacoby took that idea and said, it's not just true of amnesic patients. It's true of all of us. That when we see something, it leaves a bit of a trace, and that trace may not be accessible to conscious awareness. That is to say, if I asked you, did you see these words on the list that I gave you? You may say, I don't remember. But if I suddenly said to you, give me a word that begins with M, that's 5 letters, you might say motel. And motel was on the list, even though you didn't remember that it was on the list. Okay. And many of us have these more intuitive experiences of implicit memory. Ask me, have you seen the movie X? And I will say, I don't think so. Or, yes, I remember seeing it. What was it about, Mahzarin? I can't remember a thing about that movie, but I remember that I liked it. Okay, so that's an interesting example of an implicit form of memory. A preference, a liking for it is present in the absence of any recollection about the facts and figures of what the movie was. So these ideas of implicit memory were in the air when I was in graduate school, and I became very interested in doing a test just to replicate. I wanted to replicate Larry Jacoby's experiment, in which he gave people names like Sebastian Weisdorf, just pulled out of a phone book. In those days, that's exactly what we would have done. We would have gone to a physical phone book and pulled out random names. And he took those names And he showed them to people on day one and just said, just read these names. Okay. So you would read a name like Sebastian Weisdorf. It doesn't mean anything to you, nor should it. It's just a name from a phone book. Now you go away and then you come back 2 days later and he presents you with a new list. This list consists not only of those names that you saw from the phone book, like Sebastian Weisdorf, but also new names, James Walker or some other name that is a new name, also from the phone book, and names of some famous people in it, names of past presidents, athletes, rock stars, poets, whatever, whoever, people, names that people would be familiar with. And now he mixes all these names up and he says to people, tell me, is this person famous? Now, if you saw a name like Ronald Reagan and you were American, you would, of course, say, yeah, he's famous. He used to be a president of the United States. But the real question for him was not that. How are you going to treat Sebastian Weisdorf versus, let's say, James Walker? Both are names from the phone book. Neither of them is famous. And Larry predicted that in that moment, people's implicit memory would operate. That is to say, they would remember vaguely that they heard and they saw letters that looked like the features of Sebastian Weisdorf, just the orthography of it. And that would spark in them a feeling of what he called perceptual fluency. It feels more fluent. It feels a little easier to read. And he said, if that's the case, they will mistakenly use that false feeling of familiarity and say, oh, Sebastian Weisdorf, I wonder if he's a Canadian hockey player or something. And you will mistakenly circle that name. So that's the result. Names you have seen in the past will be incorrectly identified to be famous, more likely, than names you haven't seen. And in fact, if you remembered that Sebastian Weisdorf was on the list before, you won't make that mistake because you would say, I know the source of the familiarity. It comes from my having seen that name 2 days ago. No bias, no misidentification as famous. But it's when you don't have explicit memory, but there is indeed some lingering familiarity, when there is implicit memory, that's when the error would happen. So all I wanted to do, without any thought about the kind of work I eventually did, was to replicate that result. And so I wrote to him and he sent me the materials, and I noticed that the materials had only male names in it. Now, I don't know if your audience will be interested in this story, but in the dark ages, in the 1980s, when a woman was hired by a department like mine, psychology, this was at Yale, you were asked the question, would you please teach a course on the psychology of gender? And I was asked that question and I was horrified. Why? I said, I've never done any research on this topic. And the chair of the department said, I know, I'm really sorry, but we ask every woman we hire this question because it's a popular course. Students want it and we don't have anybody to teach it. And I kind of huffed and puffed and said, of course not. It didn't seem right to me that I should be asked to teach something where I had no expertise or hadn't done any work just because of my gender. And then I went away from that meeting and I wrote to, in those days, you wrote not by email, but like a letter. And I typed up a letter and I sent it off to two, there were really only two women in my field. And I wrote to them and I said, I've been asked this strange question of teaching a course on the psychology of gender. And they wrote back, they sent me big packages. They said, of course, we all teach them. And we're all asked to do it. And here are our materials. And I looked at them and it looked interesting. And so I decided I would offer that course. And the women's studies department at Yale decided to cross-list it. So it was now a psychology course called The Psychology of Gender. And I spent the first summer just learning and learning and learning to, because I, as I said, I knew nothing about it. Because it was listed in women's studies, I ended up meeting a bunch of people who just thought very differently from me because they came from history. and English and a bunch of the humanities mostly, very few from, in fact, I don't even remember anybody from the social or natural sciences. And I have a feeling that this did matter. So I say it because I think in that moment, I could have done the Jacobi study exactly as he had done it because there was no reason to add women's names. There was no interest in gender. We assumed that what would happen to the male names would also happen for female names. And I cannot tell you exactly why I spent 3 summer months generating names of women that would match the names of men and so on. But for every Sebastian Weisdorf, I had to come up with a Stephanie Weisdorf. And for every famous male name, I had to come up with a famous female. And, I didn't do the study perfectly, but I did it. And I did it with male and female names. And this may be just a sort of a little side story to how certain things in science get done, that because of who you are and because of where you wander in the academic intellectual landscape, you end up just doing things a little bit differently. And when you do that, there is the possibility of a breakthrough that wouldn't have happened. I do the study. I expect Stephanie and Sebastian to become equally famous overnight, mistakenly, because they were familiar. And it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the sense that Sebastian Weisdorf gets identified much more likely to be famous than Stephanie Weisdorf. And you have to know that this was shocking because as a psychologist, I knew that in terms of perception, in terms of having seen the words, both names had been made equally familiar. But at the very tail end, when you have to make that decision, who shall we hire? Who is the famous one? Something had led people to say Sebastian, but not equally to Stephanie. Now, to most people, this may have been, not interesting, but maybe where I was heading with the people I was interacting with told me that this is much more important than just looking at implicit memory. And I assumed in those days, and this will tell you how naive we were then, and why I say you don't go around looking to study implicit bias. When it happens, if you're lucky, you will recognize it. That there's something sitting in front of you that's more interesting than the thing you were studying. And what I thought was, oh, this is how naive I was. People are using a conscious rule. They know that men are more famous than women. So when time comes to make these judgments, they're saying, you know what? If it's Stephanie, it's a woman. And because it's a woman, not likely to be famous, therefore do not identify that name. So I began to ask that question. After each person was in the experiment, I would say, how did you make the decision to judge the fame of a name? And they would tell me, I did this, I did that. But nobody, not one of the 400 or so people I tested said, oh, I used the gender of the name. So that puzzled me. So I began to ask them the question, did you use the gender of the name in making your decision? Just straight up, yes or no. And they would look at me like I was a monster. What do you mean? You think I'm sexist? You think I wouldn't have circled Stephanie just because she's female? Of course not. So now I became even more interested. These were people who explicitly were telling me that they were not using gender to make their decision. But in the data, it was absolutely clear that they were being biased. So that's the first paper that we wrote saying these names could be equally familiar in our brain, but when time comes to make a decision, we are using a different standard. And luckily for me, there was a brilliant old method in psychology. It's called signal detection theory. It allows you to separate signal from noise. And I used that particular statistical tool to demonstrate that people were indeed using a lower standard to say a man was famous and a higher standard to say women were famous.
So basically, you can plaster your name all over the city and become famous overnight, unless you're a woman.
And women will become famous. It's not like the women didn't become famous. The names of women that you had seen were also being judged to be more famous than the names you had never seen. So there will be some advantage to the familiarity, but not nearly as much as it might be for a male name. And, somebody should do this study again and see if that bias still remains, because that was 30 years ago. Yes.
I imagine your work sparked a lot of curiosity, but probably it also made some people uncomfortable, right? So I'm curious about the initial response that your research had, both within academia and how it evolved later on, and how it was digested, I suppose, by the broader society and then the world.
So people were totally accepting of this result, because I wasn't saying you, the scientist, you would have shown this bias. I was showing it in some people out there, the biased people. And this is where I would say, and there'd been many such studies in psychology. By that time, there were people, and we were, oh yeah, seems to be some implicit form of bias. What changed the tone and what did ruffle feathers is the invention of the IAT, the implicit association test that Tony Greenwald initially worked on, and that Brian Nosek and I co-developed with him. The implicit association test is a test anybody can take at any time. It's online. And it requires you to rapidly associate a few different things. Imagine, very simply for your audience listening, that on a computer screen, words would pop up, and they're words of either insects like bug and fly and flea and things like that, or words that that represent names of flowers like daisy and tulip and daffodil, things like that. And for half the trials in this test, you have to use the same keyboard key to identify flowers, but also any general word that means good things in the world. Words like love, peace, joy, friend, sunshine, good things. And then when you see an insect word like bug or flea, the same key that you say, oh, that's a bug name, is also the key that you would use to identify names that are not bugs or flowers or good, but bad things. Words like devil or bomb, vomit, awful, failure, things like that. This is very easy for us to do. Left for flowers or good things, right for insects or bad things. Super easy. My brain does it because in my mind, those are now have become associated. Flowers are good in our society and in our, maybe even in our biological orientation. Insects are things we're scared of or don't think are pleasant. Very easy. But I would like to think that as a conscious being, if you made me do the opposite, if you say use the left key, Mahzarin, for flowers and bad and insects and good, I should be able to do it just for a little while. It's not, I don't have to change my mind about insects and flowers, but it shouldn't be hard for me to say left key for flowers and bad, right key for insects and good. But it is hard. It is nearly impossible to do. It takes so much longer. You make so many more mistakes. And so this test is a very interesting one in that it very quickly, in 4 minutes or so, can give you a measure of the strength of association in your mind between flowers and good and insects and bad, right? How strong is that association? By forcing you to do the easy version and then the harder version of making the opposite association. Nobody had trouble with insect and flower. But as soon as you replaced insects and flowers with, let's say, light-skinned people and dark-skinned people, good and bad, now in people like me. So before I tell you about the reaction anybody else had, I can tell you the reaction I had, because I'm one of those incredibly fortunate scientists who gets to be a subject in her own experiment. Okay. So I can now test myself because I can't control the answers. I'm not being asked a survey question. How much do you like flowers or insects? There I could say whatever I want. But here I couldn't. The data would give me a very stark, give me very stark feedback on what that difficulty level is. So when I did this dark skin, light skin equivalent study, I was just stunned that I could not associate light skinned with bad and dark skin with good. Now, your audience can't see me, but I'm dark skinned myself or somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. I'm certainly not white. And I was just shocked that I couldn't associate people like me or my group with good. And I thought to myself, there's something wrong with the test. I say this, something is wrong with the test, because many people have that reaction. And I did too. And I don't blame anybody for having that reaction in the first moment when they take such a test. How you know yourself, you've worked hard your whole life to be unbiased, and now some stupid little test that's measuring reaction time at the level of 200 300 milliseconds is telling you that you're biased. Of course you are not going to be happy with that. But how long you disbelieve is an interesting question. You could use this test as a measure of a person's, I don't know, intellectual, not intelligence, but some kind of cultural, intellectual intelligence. Yes, your first reaction could be, that's crazy, that's not me, something's wrong with the test. But thinking about it just a little bit should bring you to the conclusion that it's picking up something that is in your head. You just didn't know. So we've had lots of reactions. Now, I have to say, I'm really admiring of people who take the test and say, oh, I knew exactly I would fail on this test. And I'll come back and say what fail means here, because there's no grade or no points or anything like that. So those people are very special. And I have to say, I am so humbled when I meet people who take the test, and even as they're taking it, they'll say, I know how this is going to come out. It's not going to make me happy, but I know it's true. So that's one kind of response, and they're a rare group. I would say the vast majority of people today, and even then, were people who took a little time to understand it and then came to terms with it. But many people had trouble with it, including the very scientists who study bias. So imagine you are, in those days, white, perhaps most likely male, although by then there were women in this field. You have spent your whole life trying to demonstrate that American society is prejudiced. You have designed surveys and you have shown that people say things like, I will kick my daughter out of our house if she marries a black man, things like that. You've been doing that kind of work. And all of a sudden, these three people come around, Greenwald, Nozick, and Banaji, and they say, you, the person who's studying prejudice, you may be biased. That, I think, was hard. So I think even within the field, we did meet with resistance. And the resistance almost, I would say, came from people using different methods to study bias, who would have had to confront the fact that, I mean, they would say things to us like, do you know that I marched with Martin Luther King Jr. into Selma, Alabama? I protested with him. And I would say, amazing, great, you did that. I wish I had been there and had done that. But that's not what we're getting at. We're not interested in people's conscious beliefs, their conscious preferences, their conscious attitudes. We're trying to pick up something that's there, that's the thumbprint of the culture on our brain. And maybe this method is not the greatest, but it's giving us the first direct evidence. It's like having a telescope and you look out there, and if the moons of Jupiter are not doing what the Vatican says they should be doing, what are you going to do? Are you going to talk about it, or are you going to bury it? And we decided not only to talk about it, but we really irritated people by putting these tests online in 1998, when the web was not developed at all. When places like my university were thrilled when their site would crash because it meant people were coming to your site. So I'll just tell you that we put 4 tests up in 1998 on a website. We did nothing much. We just the university put out a little note saying we had, a test. And we expected, a few people. We thought, wow, I was so bold. I predicted that in a year we might have 500 people. And wouldn't that be exciting? And there's a second reason to be excited about this besides the work on implicit bias. Studies at the time were entirely done with college students. All of psychology was students who were in college between the ages of, 18 and 22, and they were our subjects in our studies. And I thought to myself, on something as controversial perhaps as this, people will say, well, if your Yale students show these biases, who cares? Maybe they're biased. Maybe, in those days, Yale students came from rich families. Today, there's much greater economic diversity, but not then. And so we thought they might say, well, they come from a certain sociodemographic location, and those people may be biased. Why should I believe I am? So I thought it would be really great to put it online because we would get some real people taking the test. But the prediction, at least I had in my mind, was 500 in a year. And wouldn't that be amazing? Big, big N at the time. My FAME studies, each of those experiments had like 40 people in them. So this would have been a big data set. And we were just not prepared for what was to happen. In the first month, with no advertising, just word of mouth, we had 45,000 completed tests. People just came in droves to the site. They took tests, and we made sure that they could write to us. And I think that first month after we opened the site, I think we were sleeping very little. We were just staying up around the clock. Somebody was monitoring the site to make sure that we were answering every question that came in. And those questions were insightful. They were moving. They were provocative. Some were angry. But we were learning very fast that there was this whole range of responses and that we had a responsibility to now do more and answer these questions. Yeah.
Two things that come to mind listening to what you're saying are those. One thing is, what do we now do with what we have found out? And the other one is, how should society react to that? I mean, should implicit bias be a determining factor in promotions, for example, or hiring decisions? Is there an acceptable threshold for the level of implicit bias? Is there a test that we take after some kind of an implicit bias training to measure if it has been reduced?
The first question is, once we know, what do we do? I think it's like anything else. Once we know that the presence of human beings on the planet has led to the current climate crisis, what do we do? I think that this issue we're talking about is about the climate inside our head, not the climate outside. And it is just as complicated, and it is just as severe, and it is in need of attention in the same way. But think about how hard climate is and how hard it will be to fix it. I mean, so far we've made dents here and there, but every year the Earth is warmer than it was the previous year. Things are getting to a point where really smart experts think that we are going to irrevocably damage the planet and ourselves. It's a huge issue, and we will go at it in a certain set of ways, and the politics will be just as great. I recently spoke to a climate scientist who was one of the first people in the late 90s to speak about this issue. And his history and his story is really frightening because he lost his job, his child was kidnapped, people left dead rats at his doorstep for simply saying that the balance of evidence suggests that there is discernible human influence on climate. I feel very lucky when I hear his story because I have managed to get through my whole career without anybody having kidnapped any family member of mine. But it is the case that the reason he got that response was because that sentence said, now that we know that humans are involved in having had this impact, and the impact is very negative, we must do something about it. So take any problem in the world and take something very simple. So climate is the big one, and I'll compare the state inside our heads to something as big as that and what it's going to take to deal with it. But take something very simple. We had no idea that the blood that is running around in our bodies has a certain level of pressure. At some point, we discovered that that pressure could be too high. And when that pressure is too high, we will die from it, that it will do something to our heart. What do you do when you discover that? You know it's going to happen, you're going to die, and you can't do anything about it. And then decade after decade, we make progress. We build a machine. We build a machine that today, I can strap on something that in a few seconds will give me an indication of my blood pressure. I think the IAT is very similar. The implicit association test, it's not perfect, but it actually has better reliability than a blood pressure machine. And it can tell us roughly, are we in the red zone or are we okay, right? And so we've developed methods to first of all, detect it. But detecting that blood pressure is high is not the solution. So often people will say something quite silly to me. Can taking the IAT reduce my bias? Of course not. Taking the IAT will tell you if you have a certain kind of bias. And you may be very pleased to discover, if you want to be unbiased, that on some things you don't have bias. I've discovered that myself. I, for example, have no anti-gay bias. I can, speculate why that is, but I'm straight. I have no anti-gay bias. If anything, I show an association of gay with good over straight with good. And I have some explanations for why that might be true in my life, from the community I came from and the people I knew, and a tolerance of gay people from the time I was a child in India, and so on. But I think that that's the discovery. I know I don't have to worry about that bias because I'm not likely to screw up in that domain. Okay. So I come to this point of when we think about what to do now, of course, if it was medicine, we would develop drugs. That's one way, but also we would say behavioral change, reduce your stress, eat better, do all of them. I think when we think about implicit bias, we will not get bent out of shape as we seem to if we think about it as any other issue we have confronted as a species that teaches us something about ourselves that is not happy news. Some of it could just be, I have a tumor in my brain, from there all the way to we're harming the planet. I think we should go about it in a much more effective way than we have with climate, by just, first of all, admitting that it's there, admitting that it can have impact, and then going about figuring out, and I've been pushing this idea, not one level, but 3 levels at which we should try to make change, because I'm quite persuaded that if we do any one of them, it will have almost no impact, but that a little bit on all 3 will push us forward. And the 3 levels are the individual level. You, Anna, I, Mahzarin, we can use the power, the gift of conscious awareness to say, what kind of human do I wish to be? And how can I get to that stage? And how can I learn more about what this thing is, in the same way as I would want to learn about my blood pressure? And we can go about taking certain actions. And I don't have the scope right here to say it, but I do teach about it. I give a couple of different lectures, Blind Spot 1.0 and then Blind Spot 2.0. And the 2.0 is the place where we begin to think in the workplace, what can an individual do? So, but individuals alone will have very little, if not zero impact, unless they're assisted by what I call the middle level of our society. And that's institutions. My university, your university, any organization. It's not just, a university type place, any organization. It could be a government's labor department. Each of these middle level institutions can say, we want to do something about it here. We don't have control over the larger society, but we're not going to just let individuals, keep working on these on their own. We're going to come up with policies to help this move forward. And I'll give you an example. Gay marriage was not legal in the United States until not that long ago. But even when it was illegal, organizations did move in a pro-gay direction. Why? Because their employees had same-sex live-in partners. What were we going to do about their health care? To me, that's an example of how an institution decides we're gonna treat them as if they were married, which many institutions did a lot earlier than long before gay marriage was legalized, right? Because we had to take care of our people. So I think institutions at that level have great leverage. And when you do something like that, you're just moving a lever in a much bigger way for change than individuals trying to do it on their own. Even though I think the individual part is extremely important. And without the buy-in from individuals, you cannot get the institution to just come in and do something, because that will create backlash, okay? So these are important that they go together. And then the third level, I just say that's the one that is least in our individual control, although it is through voting. And that is, what do our society's big institutions do? What does government do? What does the Supreme Court do? Those levers make huge differences. And I have colleagues who actually study this sort of thing. Take two states, both have gay rights referendum for voting. One votes in a pro-gay direction, the other votes in a not pro-gay direction. What happens to gay people in those states after those referendums have passed? Does their mental health improve? And those data are very interesting because it shows that something at that societal level, that big level, also has implications for us. So I think if we think about change at these three levels, and in a rational way, as we have with many other problems, we should be on a good path to thinking about solutions.
On the Hidden Brain podcast, you voiced this theory that we discriminate by choosing who we help. I was swept away by this idea. So I would like you, if you're willing, to ask you to share that thought with our audience. You said, I will quote, "Helping can often be the way in which we keep the world unequal, and yet we don't count it as such."
Yes, I don't remember exactly what I said, but this is an important idea to me, because you said I was swept away by it, and I think that's exactly how I felt as well. I was stunned because in my own thinking, and I'm supposed to be an expert on these issues, I've been reading, but I almost always thought about bias as the harm that we're doing to other people. When I don't hire the person of a certain skin tone or religion or nationality, it's the harm I'm doing. And then the data in psychology, they were not explicit, but it was coming through that really what we're seeing is in-group love. It's us doing. Often people didn't express negativity towards the out-group. They just expressed love for their in-group. And what's wrong with that? It's in fact perfectly okay. That's how we survived as human beings, by taking care of the people who are in our group, whatever the group is. Could be my building. I live in a building of 17 other people. We have our issues and we must deal with them as a community. And so I should take care of my building and my building's people. I'm not harming anybody else. I'm just taking care of my own. What's wrong with that? And so it came to me as a real revelation that we're just not the kind of humans we used to be in our long past, and our ancestors used to explicitly have to harm other people in order to survive. You had to get on a horse or whatever, and go off to some other place and take their stuff and bring it back to us, or kill off somebody. And every day you would perform actions that would tell you, I did harm somebody, and I'm glad I did, because we survived because of that. You and I, Anna, we are on the planet today because our ancestors, whoever they were successful in demolishing somebody else who couldn't leave any successors. And so, in a sense, that is, the history of humans. you fight for survival, and the ones who survive get to leave their mark on the planet. But think about the difference today. You don't get on a horse every day. You don't go off to some neighboring village in Portugal to, kill off somebody to get food. We live in times that are like living like kings did in the past. Many of us, not all of us by any means, there are parts of the world where we know that conflict looks to us almost barbaric, like it was 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or more. But by and large, the standard of living across the planet has changed. And I can speak to this. I was born and raised in post-colonial India. And just for me to see the shift in that country over the last 60, 70 years is astonishing. Nobody would have believed that this country would have been able to come out of poverty like it did. So there are now many, many more people in parts of the world who do not have to do what our ancestors did. So we don't have the experience of harming. And helping is a very positive thing to do. If somebody drops a box and I help them pick it up, good for me. Okay, of course I should do that. But now let's think about how we discriminate by helping. So every act of helping, I'll give you, just a simple example. Let's say that I get to know you and you say to me, Mahzarin, I have a friend who's studying implicit bias and she wants to learn something. Can she spend 3 months in your lab? And I say, oh, okay, Anna, sure. Why doesn't she come? She comes, she's good, she does some work. I write her a letter of recommendation. She goes on to her next position in a PhD program or something, right? This may seem really small, but if you count how this ends up materializing with thousands, millions of little acts like this that we do, for each time I let somebody, a friend of a friend in, I am not letting somebody else in, right? I mean, so on the one hand, this is a very hard problem. And sometimes when I say this to people, they say, but what can we do? And I say, I'm not saying that we shouldn't help. You should help, but be aware that your help is systematically creating a easier path for certain people than others. Now, if the world were flat in hierarchy, if everybody had equal power, and each of us with our equal power were helping the people we know, I don't think that we would be in trouble. But we're in trouble because each of us is not equal in the power we have. I think of myself as a person of enormous power in my little world of academia. I just put it bluntly, I can have influence on the shape of a life by what I choose to do. How much do I let them into the lab? How many hours do I spend with them? How much do I coach them? How much do I mentor them? How much do I tell them, no, don't go to that university. You don't want to be there with the problems that they have there. You should go here. Like, you can do these little things and change a person's career and life. Well, given that we don't have equal amounts of power and control, then the ones who do have power are disproportionately helping other people they know to become like them. And these are the systematic ways in which helping ends up being, I think, the path of discrimination. Now, I would argue that at the individual level, we should maybe be aware of this a little bit. So if I let your friend into my lab, I should ask myself, what am I doing to make sure that I reach out to the National Science Foundation to get some summer funding in order to allow somebody I don't know to also get into my lab? I could do that as an individual. But I don't think individuals doing that is going to be easy or really even equate this problem of systematic differential helping. This is where I do think institutions need to come in. We just need to acknowledge that there is a disparity in our society where people who have more will always be able to use that more to make other people like themselves get richer and richer. So my father taught me this. I remember we went to a friend's home when I was quite young, and I said, Dad, look, they have this backyard and they're growing their own rice. And my father said to me, yes, the rich get richer, right? We wouldn't have had the land to be able to grow that rice. So we would have had to pay money for it, but they have the land so they can. So these are simple little ideas that just show us how much inequality emerges from these very simple acts of helping. If institutions care about this, we will just acknowledge that we will let individuals help their friends and da da da. But the institution will come in and it will say, to compensate for that, we will maybe create fellowships. We will say that you don't have to know somebody. You don't have to know Mahzarin to be able to get in to the lab into her lab at Harvard, because the institution will create a path where really good people, not those who are coming through connections, but people who are really dedicated and who we will test and evaluate and bring in, also have that little bit of a path that they wouldn't have had, because we know they wouldn't have had it otherwise. So it seems to me kind of obvious, but I assume you have to have a certain perspective on hierarchies and so on to be able to think this way.
And on an individual level, there is also so much energy that you have, right? You cannot, everything that you do, always look back and wonder, am I being really inclusive? Sometimes it's just really easy to miss that, right? And I think what you're saying also points to the problem of meritocracy. And it's so complex because you may not be recommending a friend of a friend, but that friend may come from an institution where they have been recommended by someone, or an institution of a particular standing that is already helping them to get ahead in life, right? So it's
absolutely. Yeah, I think yes. And it's, to me, it's interesting because your reaction and mine to this problem is very much what I'm seeing in other people. If I give a talk, they often will zero in on this issue and they'll say something like, my God, I never thought about that, because when I help, I only think about how great it is that I'm helping. And I give myself a little pat on the back. And now I'm going to have to, and you can see why the topic of implicit bias is such a thorn in people's side, right? Because even good things we've done, we now need to rethink. Yes, that's exactly right. I'm sorry, but that is what I would think is at the heart of progress, that we will have to rethink even the things that we thought were just, great, and see if their impact is actually what we want. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious about your perspective on mainstream and social media. We still have a little bit of time, so I'll ask that question. Both of these platforms inundate us with so much information. Each is presenting itself uniquely and offering a distinct narrative. With such abundance, there seems to be a truth tailored for every individual, allowing us to sort of cherry pick what aligns with our beliefs. There's many researchers that argue that we are already living in a post-truth universe. So while this may seem advantageous, enabling us to thoroughly verify the facts, I wonder, what are your thoughts on what it takes for us to believe something and how deeply these narratives can embed themselves in our minds? I mean, the media has mastered the art of leveraging language, tone, and vocabulary to influence us, sometimes even overriding our rational judgment. Personally, how do you navigate the misinformation effect and maintain a critical mindset?
I was just writing the obituary of a colleague of mine, and he graduated in the 1950s, and he became interested then in the question of misinformation, mass communication. In the 1950s, people were like, everybody has a radio now. Everybody can, is listening to, whatever station that they want. And exactly the issues that you're talking about. What are we going to do about mass communication? The problem, it was called mass communication. And it came about in response to the question of how did Nazi propaganda work so effectively? And so, in a funny kind of a way, we are back thinking about the same issue, just on a scale that is not comparable at all to what we would have confronted in the 1950s. And So without going into the details of everything that you've just mentioned in your question, the world is more open to us, I think, because of the internet. I am a smarter person. There is no question in my mind that I know more, that is true, but I also know that I have to know how to distinguish what is fact from fiction. And that, unfortunately, we have not trained or educated people enough to be able to do. So now the options are greater. You could become better in so many ways. I've been myself wanting to learn to be an artist, and I cannot tell you just how amazing the world of art on the internet is. Just take YouTube. If I want to learn a particular technique, there is an artist somewhere in the world willing to teach it to me for free. Okay. We are learning, we're improving, we're giving for free, we're doing all sorts of amazing things. We don't pay attention to that. We are paying attention, of course, to the nasty side of the internet. I don't know if this number is true, so I will, but I've heard that, it's only 8% of the internet that is loud and angry and, does things that are, less than ideal, but that because they're so loud, it kind of gives us this. So who knows? I don't know what those numbers are. I don't know it's possible to actually get those numbers. But you're asking it from that side. There is all sorts of stuff. And you talked about the funneling, and I think the funneling problem is a separate one, and it's the silos, or the whatever we want to call them, the bubble that each of us. I mean, a long time ago, maybe a decade ago, when I first heard that Facebook was looking at people's feed and deciding and implemented an algorithm that will show you certain feeds more than others. I remember saying to myself, well, that's terrible. I should have that choice. I should be able to say, no, please don't choose for me. I want it to come at me randomly, because otherwise I'll be systematically missing certain things and so on. So the question is, given all of this, I believe that a large part of the implicit biases we hold do come to us from all sorts of forms of media. But because the internet is also a vehicle of progress, and it can give me information that teaches me that a false belief I had about a group is actually false, it also is a place where I can improve. And we won't have time to go into this, but one of my students, a brilliant woman by the name of Tessa Charlesworth, did these analyses of implicit bias data over time. And there are many biases, even the implicit ones, that are actually coming down. Anti-gay bias, we predict in a year and a half, will be at neutrality in the United States. Anti-Black bias, dark-skinned bias has come down by 25%. Sexuality bias by 64%. These are astonishing changes. And I wouldn't be surprised if we will see that there were certain events that were happening in our world where people were thinking, and the number of podcasts that now one can hear, and so many of them are so rich and so good, that these are also improving us. Yes, there are many biases that are not changing. Bias against people with disability, anti-fat bias, anti-elderly bias. And we can ask the question, why not? Are we not talking enough about that? So sexuality, race, things like that are more fraught, but maybe that's good. Maybe in our society, we're arguing and fighting about these issues that are contested, but at least, I'm seeing change in those. The ones that are not being argued as ferociously. Nobody's talking about anti-elderly bias much, but it's really severe. Disability bias, we don't talk about those quite as much, and those are not changing. So all this to say, I think that there can be a lot of good that media can do, and I think probably does do, and it also has exactly the kinds of negative impact that you are probably thinking about when you raise this question. But it's very important as a feeder into who we are and what we will become. And you may be interested in asking at some point, what kinds of things am I working on now? And I'm actually working in a sense on that. That is to say, I'm very interested in going into large language corpora that technology today makes available. I can go into something called the Common Crawl. That's 850 billion words captured from the internet in 2014, 2017, just 1 week, let's say, of the internet. That is a trained database that gives us a snapshot of what was being said on the entire net, all of those 850 billion words, right? I can go into that database and I can start to look at what is the strength of bias? How strongly is female associated with respect and strength and leadership? How much is male associated with that? And what if in the language, we see evidence of implicit bias, see evidence of bias that reflects or looks very much like implicit bias in humans' minds. I didn't do the first study, but another brilliant woman, Eileen Caliskin, she's a computer scientist who did that study. She took that common crawl and she published the study saying, oh, look, what we're finding in the language is exactly what the IAT people are finding in humans. In other words, what's in our head gets dumped onto the internet. More important, what's on the internet then reinforces, maintains what those stereotypes are. So since that study was published, I have been on a tear trying to interrogate different databases. Google Books are available, billions of books from 1800 to 2020. Can we look for change in people's thinking in the language when it comes to groups like nationality or socioeconomic status or gender or whatever one might be interested in? And this is taking up all of our time because the methods are new. And then, of course, that leads us to the next question, which is an obvious one that LLMs are generating. Take ChatGPT. If ChatGPT really contains the errors and biases of humans, given that's its training data, to what extent not only will it reflect those biases, but ratchet them up, amplify them in some way, Eileen discovered that if you take a Turkish is a language that has no gender pronouns. So there's no he and she, just the letter O represents whatever you want to call it or that person or whatever. So in Turkish, she noticed that if you say something like "O bir doctor," meaning that person is a doctor, Google translates that from Turkish to English as "he is a doctor." But if you write in Turkish, "O bir hemşire," which is that person is a nurse, Google translates that as "she is a nurse." Now, what's interesting about this is that Google is just using some base rates. If you look at doctors, they tend to be more male, although that's not really that true anymore. But still, let's say it's doing some historical analysis and it's saying, I'll just pick the one that is more. What's wrong with that? I'll pick female when it's nurse and I'll pick male when it's doctor. And then, of course, it went viral and lots of people spoke about it and they fixed that. But, they're not fixing everything in that way. So this is another interesting example of how these algorithms are likely, if we are not careful, to actually increase level of bias. On the other hand, we are in charge of these databases. OpenAI can do whatever the hell it wants to do with ChatGPT. And it could make it a priority that it will figure out how to do this. And as you can, I don't know if you followed this, but let's say they want it to be unbiased. They want GPT to be unbiased. To be unbiased is not so simple. I don't know if you read about what Gemini did. This is, I think, Google's LLM called Gemini. It was asked to generate images of historical people, Native Americans, the people who founded modern America. And Gemini wants to be so neutral that it has African Americans as parts of the founding fathers of the United States. It has white and Black Americans as Native Americans, because it wants to be unbiased in generating images. So you can see that this is not a simple task. But someday, if we're lucky, we will have an AI that will make better decisions than an evolved human could. And that, of course, is the hope.
That is the hope. That was my next and last question for you about your both ongoing and forthcoming projects. You have mentioned this one. Is there anything else you would like to add? What are you currently working on?
So the initial work we did on implicit bias was what I would regard to be sort of the core work. But I've always sort of wanted to wander around a little bit. And the first thing I became interested in was looking at what is the neural basis of all of this? Where in the brain, how in the brain does it happen? And so I was very fortunate to be able to team up with neuroscientists, in particular with a woman by the name of Elizabeth Phelps, who was a very fine neuroscientist on the topic of emotion. So that was her interest. And we said, wow, given that people aren't believing our IAT data, wouldn't it be interesting if we could just do a study to see, is there any neural basis to this effect? And the first study we did showed a beautiful pattern. If you show people faces of dark and light-skinned people, in this case, they were actually African American and European American faces of strangers, not anybody known. And we look at a region of our brain that is involved in this kind of learning of emotion, like something is friendly and good, something that is dangerous and you better stay away from it. Simple Pavlovian conditioning, just the same way as if I hear a particular sound when somebody I like enters the room, then just hearing the sound will make me feel that kind of happiness that this person is going to arrive, just like a dog does when it hears the footsteps of its I don't want to say owner, but whatever we want to call people who have dogs. And so what is interesting about that study is that it demonstrated that the degree of reaction that we were seeing in this brain region called the amygdala, which is involved in this particular kind of, among other things, in this kind of, sensitivity to information that is different, unique, something that we should be wary of, that the degree to which a person was showing that bias in response to Black rather than white faces or Black over white faces was highly correlated with their performance on a race test on the IAT. So that was one foray. And then I moved from Yale to Harvard, where I ended up meeting these two amazing developmental psychologists, Liz Spelke and Susan Carey. And they studied very young children. They studied infants. And I started to think to myself, well, how early does implicit bias begin? And we didn't know the answer to that. And I had the wrong idea that, you grow up, you're born unbiased, and then you slowly become biased. Well, that's more or less true because it is learned, but I was unprepared for how fast it's learned. I was just shocked by the data that showed that 3-year-olds are showing the same level of bias on the implicit tests as adults are. So that changed our minds and said, my gosh, this stuff seems to look to us to be almost like built in, but it's not really built in. The mechanism for learning it is built in, but not the actual content. They don't know mommy kitchen, daddy office, but they're learning that, but they're learning it really, really early, very fast. And there's fascinating work with infants showing how even in the first few days after birth, you're orienting towards the one who's familiar. So if you have a female caregiver, you will orient that way. But if you have a male caregiver, you will like males more than females. So these kinds of data were really powerful and very important. And it filled out the picture of what we were learning with just the adults that we were testing. And then the third foray has been into this language work. So I would say that this is how, if you're lucky, you get to do a piece of work and then you start to look at if that's your house, then you start to build little extensions of your house and add little rooms that tell you a little bit more about it. And so I would just present it that way and say there have been many different, and each of them has taken about a decade of work to do.
There's so much I would like to talk to you about, but there's only so much time we have. So thank you, Mahzarin, for this illuminating conversation, so relevant today. Now, I'm thinking that perhaps it isn't so much the scope of the problem, but the timing that sparks some change. What you said about the fact that we change when we clash, I thought that was wonderful. And also so illuminating, right? All these problems were here yesterday, but perhaps today it is really high time for us to truly embrace them, to embrace the fact that we are far from perfect, and there's no shame in that. That better world is hard work, however simplistic it wouldn't sound. So I encourage you all to work hard, but on yourself. I don't mean the industrialized hard work. Invest in yourself because you are your biggest asset. Do that by having a look at Mahzarin's repertoire of published works, which you'll find linked underneath this episode. Mahzarin, all the best to you. Looking forward to taking more of your tests and getting frustrated with myself.
Sounds terrific to me.